Good day everyone, I am Apollish B. Laurente, one of the reporters from Group 9. Today we will discuss about Lesson 9, Postmodernism. But before we start, let me introduce first the other reporters. We have Mauricio Rialu, Glidel Pungaron, and Krisha Bucalon. So guys, fasten your seatbelt because we are going to explore all about postmodernism. So for the learning objectives, in this lesson, students will be able to first define and understand what is postmodernism. Second, to examine the characteristic of postmodernism. Third, to identify the relationship of modernism to postmodernism. And lastly, we have to identify the different views of postmodernism in different individuals. Postmodernism. Postmodernism was a reaction to modernism, where modernism was about objectivity. Postmodernism was about subjectivity, where modernism sought a singular truth. Postmodernism sought the multiplicity of the truths, according to Miguel Sayhuco. Postmodernism is a term current inside and outside of the academic study of popular culture. It has entered the discourses as different as pop, music, journalism, and Marxist debates on the cultural conditions of the late or multinational capitalism, as Angela Mock Robbie of 1994 observes. Postmodernism is a late 20th century style and concept in arts, architecture, and criticism that represent a departure from modernism and has its heart a general distrust of grand theories and ideologies as well as problematical relationship with any notion of art. Postmodernism means a number of trends or movements in the arts and literature, developing in the 1970s in reaction to or rejection of the dogma principles or practices of established modernism, especially a movement in architecture and influence of international style, and encouraging the use of elements from historical informal styles and often playful illusion, decoration, and complexity. The term was applied to a whole host of movements, mainly as art, music, and literature, that reacted against a range of tendencies in the imperialist phase of capitalism called modernism, and art typically marked by revival and historical elements and techniques. Postmodernism has entered into a more diverse number of vocabularies more quickly than most other intellectual categories. It has spread outwards from the realms of art, history into political theory, and onto the pages of youth culture magazines, record sleeves, and fashion pages of Vogue. Postmodernism in 1960s. Bess and Kellner in 1991. Although the term postmodern had been in cultural circulation since the 1870s, it is only in late 1950s and 1960s that we see the beginnings of what is now understood as postmodernism. According to Jameson of 1988, he argues that postmodernism was born out of the shift from an oppositional to hegemonic position of the classic of modernism. While Andy Warhol was also a key figure in theorizing of pop art, he claims that the real art is defined simply by a taste of the ruling class of the period. This implies not only that commercial art is just as good as real art, its value simply being defined by other social groups, other patterns of expenditure. Moreover, according to Huysen of 1986, he claims that the full impact of relationship between pop art and popular culture can only be fully understood when located within the larger cultural context of the American counterculture and the British underground scene. Pop is the broadcast sense was the context in which a notion of the postmodern first took shape and from the beginning until today. The most significant trends within postmodernism have challenged modernism's relentless hostility to mass culture. By late 1970s, the debate about modernism crossed the Atlantic. So, we have the different views of postmodernism and different individuals. We have first, Jean-Francois Lyotard. According to him, his principal contribution to the debate on postmodernism is the postmodern condition, published in France 1979 and translated into English in 1984. The influence of this book on the debate has been enormous. For Lyotard, the postmodern condition is marked by a crisis in the status of knowledge in Western societies. This is expressed an incredulity towards meta-narratives and what he calls the obsolescence of the meta-narrative apparatus of legitimation. Particularly focus is on the status and function of scientific discourse and knowledge. Before leaving Lyotard, it is worth noting his own less than favorable response to the changed status of culture. The only relief is Lyotard's view that postmodernist culture is not the end of much superior culture of modernism to form a new modernism. A work can becoming modern only if it is first postmodern. Thus, postmodernism understood is not modernism at its end but in the nascent state, and this state is constant. Next, we have Jean Baudrillard. According to Bess and Kilner, has achieved a guru status throughout the English-speaking world. They claim that Baudrillard has emerged as one of the most high-profile postmodern theorists. Baudrillard claims that he have reached a stage in social and economic development in which it is no longer possible to separate the economic or productive realm from the realms of ideology or culture. Baudrillard argues by the fact that there has been a historical shift, rather, in the West from a society based on the production of things to one based on the production of information. However, Baudrillard postmodernism is not simply a culture of high, rather, it is a culture of simulacrum.
Frederick Jameson. Frederick Jameson is an American Marxist cultural critic who has written a number of very influential essays on postmodernism. Where Jameson differs from other theorists in his insistence that postmodernism can best be theorized from within a Marxist or neo-Marxist framework. For Jameson, postmodernism is more than just a particular cultural style. It is above all a periodizing concept. 1985. Postmodernism is the cultural dominant of late or multinational capitalism. His argument is informed by Ernest Mandel's 1978 characterization of capitalism three-stage development: market capitalism, monopoly capitalism, late or multinational capitalism. Capitalism third stage constitutes the purest form of capital and to hitherto uncommodified areas. Jameson, 1984. He overlays Mandel's linear model with a tripartite schema of cultural development: realism, modernism, and postmodernism or IBID. Jameson's argument also borrows from Williams' 1980 influential claim that a given social formation will always consist of three cultural moments, such as dominant, emergent, and residual. Williams' argument is that the move from one historical period to another does not usually involve the complete collapse of one cultural mood and the installation of another. Historical change may simply bring about a shift in the relative place of different cultural moods. In a given social formation, therefore different moods will exist but only one will be dominant. It is on the basis of this claim that Jameson argues that postmodernism is the cultural dominant of late or multinational capitalism. Modernism is the residual. It is unclear what is the emergent. Having established that postmodernism is the cultural dominant within Western capitalist societies, the next stage for Jamison is to outline the constitutive features of postmodernism. First, postmodernism is said to be a culture of pastiche, a culture that is marked by the complacent play of historical allusion, Jamison 1988. Pastiche is often confused with parody. Both involve imitation and mimicry. However, whereas parody has an ulterior motive to mark a divergence from convention or a norm, pastiche is a blank parody or empty copy, which has no sense of the very possibility of there being a norm or a convention from which to diverge. As he explains, pastiche is like parody, the imitation of a peculiar mass, speech in a deed language. But it is not neutral practice of such mimicry, without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter and of any conviction that alongside the abnormal tongue you have momentarily borrowed some healthy linguistic normality still exists. Pastiche is thus blank parody. Rather than a culture of supposed pristine creativity, postmodern culture is a culture of quotation that is cultural production born out of previous cultural production. It is therefore a culture of flatness or depthlessness, a new kind of superficiality in the most literal sense. A culture of images and surfaces without latent possibilities, it derives its hermeneutic force from other images. The exhausted interplay or intertextuality. This is the world of postmodern pastiche, a world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible. All that is left is to imitate dead styles, to speak through the mass and with the voices of the style in the imaginary museum. So let's move on postmodern pop music. A discussion of postmodernism and popular culture might highlight any number of different cultural texts and practices. For example, television, music video, advertising, film, pop music, and fashion. So I have space here to consider only two examples, television and pop music. For Jamison, 1984, the difference between modernist and postmodernist pop music is quite clear. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones represent a modernist moment against which punk rock, The Clash for example, and the New Wave Talking Heads for example, can be seen as postmodernist. Andrew Goodwin 1991 has quite correctly pointed out the Jamison compressed time span solution. Pop music, culture's rapid progression through realism, rock and roll, modernism, postmodernism, enabling Jamison to establish a modernist moment against which to mark out a postmodernist response is a very difficult argument to sustain. As Goodwin convincingly argues, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones are thus different from each other, as together they are different from The Clash and Talking Heads. In fact, it would be much easier to make an argument in which the distinction is made between the artifice of the Beatles and Talking Heads and the authenticity of the Rolling Stones and The Clash. Goodwin himself considered a number of ways of seeing pop music and pop music culture as postmodernist. Perhaps its most cited aspect is the technological developments that facilitated the emergence of sampling. He acknowledged that the parallel with some postmodern theorizing is interesting and suggestive, but that is all it is, interesting and suggestive. What is often missed in such claim is the way in which sampling is used. As he explained, textual incorporation cannot be adequately understood as blank parody. We need categories to add to pastiche which demonstrate how contemporary pop opposes celebrates and promotes the text it steals from. We also need to be aware of the historizing function of sampling technologies in contemporary pop. The many ways in which sampling is used to invoke history and authenticity. Moreover, in regard to Jameson's argument about nostalgia replacing history, it has often been overlooked that the coding of sounds and styles acts to historicize contemporary culture. Rap is perhaps the best example of sampling being used in this way. When asked to name the black means of cultural expression, the African-American cultural theorist Cornel West 2009 answered music and preaching. He went on to say, rap is unique because it combines the black preacher and the black music tradition, replacing the liturgical ecclesiastical setting with the African polyrhythms of the street. A tremendous articulateness is syncopated with the African drum beat, the African funk into an American postmodern product. There is no subject expressing originary anguish here, but a fragmented subject, falling from past and present, innovatively producing a heterogeneous product. The stylistic combination of the oral, the literate, and the musical is exemplary. It is part and parcel of the subversive energies of black underclass youth, energies that are forced to take a cultural mode of articulation because of the political liturgy of American society. This is a rejection of Jameson's claims that such work can be dismissed as an example of postmodern pastiche. The intertextual play of quotation in rap is not the result of aesthetic exhaustion. These are not the fragments of postmodernism shored against aesthetic ruin and cultural decline, but fragments combined to make a voice to be heard loudly within a hostile culture. The twisting of dismissal and denial into defiance.
Postmodern television. Television, like pop music, does not have a period of modernism to which it can be post, according to Jim Collins' 1992. Television is often seen as the quintessence of postmodern culture. This claim can be made on the basis of a number of television's textual and contextual features. For example, a television series like Twin Peaks both helps to constitute an audience as bricoleurs and is watched in turn by an audience who celebrate the program's bricolage. According to Collins, postmodernist eclecticism might only occasionally be a preconceived design choice in individual programs, but it is built into the technologies of media sophisticated societies. Those television, like the postmodern subject, must be conceived as a site and intersection of multiple conflicting cultural messages. Only by recognizing this interdependency of bricolage and eclecticism can we come to appreciate the profound changes in the relationship of reception and production in postmodern cultures. Not only has reception become another form of meaning production, but production has increasingly become a form of reception as it rearticulates antecedent and competing forms of representation. Collins uses Twin Peaks as a means of bringing together the different strands of the relationship between postmodernism and television. Twin Peaks is chosen because it epitomizes the multiple dimensions of televisual postmodernism. Postmodernism of the television series is the result of a number of interrelated factors. David Lynch's reputation as a filmmaker, stylistic features of the series, and commercial intertextuality, the marketing of related products, for example, The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer. Twin Peaks marks a new era in network television's view of the audience. The series was part of a strategy in which the audience is seen as fragmented, consisting of different segments stratified by age, class, gender, sexual geography, ethnicity, and race, each of interest to different advertisers. The significance of Twin Peaks is that it represents an attempt by American network television to win back a affluent section of the television audience supposedly lost to cable, cinema, and video. In short, the so-called Yappie generation. Similar marketing techniques have been used to promote many recent television programs. The obvious example are Desperate Housewives, Sex and the City, 6 Feet Under, The Sopranos, and Lost. Oscillation in discursive register and generic conventions is a primary factor in many recent television programs. The key point to understand with regard to Twin Peaks and postmodernism is that what makes the program different from another or other television programs is not that it produces shifting viewing positions, but that it explicitly acknowledges this oscillation and the suspended nature of television viewing. Postmodernism and the pluralism of value. Postmodernism has disturbed many of the old certainties surrounding questions of cultural value. In particular, it has problematized the question of why some texts are canonized while others disappear without trace. That is why only certain texts supposedly pass the test of time. It is very difficult to see how a process in which only certain people have the power and cultural authority to ensure the canonical reproduction of texts and practices can really be described as simply an effect of a text polysemy. Rather than begin with polysemy, cultural studies would begin with power. Put simply, a text will survive its moment of production if it is selected to meet the needs and desires of people with cultural power. Surviving its moment of production makes it available to meet the usually different desires and needs of other generations of people with cultural power. Particular interests articulated in specific social and historical contexts always inform the selective tradition. In this way, what constitutes the selective tradition is as much about policing knowledge as it is about organizing terrains of critical inquiry. Of course, when we ascribe value to a text or practice, we are not or rarely ever saying this is only of value to me. Our evaluation always or usually always includes the notion that the text or practice should also be of value to others. The trouble with some forms of evaluation is that they insist that their community of others is an ideal community, with absolute cultural authority over all other valuing communities. Perhaps the most significant thing about postmodernism for the student of popular culture is the dawning recognition that there is no absolute categorical difference between high and popular culture. This is not to say that one text or practice might not be better than another text or practice, but it is to say that there are no longer any easy reference points to which we can refer and which will automatically pre-select for us the good from the bad. On the contrary, without easy recourse to fixed categories of value, it calls for rigorous, if always contingent, standards if our task is to separate the good from the bad, the usable from the obsolete, the progressive from the reactionary.
The global postmodern. Globalization is one manner in which the world is thought to be getting more postmodern. Perhaps the most common interpretation of globalization, particularly in discussions of globalization and culture, is that it reduces the world to an American global village in which everyone speaks English with an American accent. Wears Levi jeans and Wrangler shirts, drinks Coca-Cola, eats at McDonald's, surf the internet on a computer loaded with Microsoft software, listens to rock or country music, watches a mix of MTV and CNN, and watches Hollywood movies. This argument is presented in a fairly concise manner by populations. This scenario, in which the economic success of American capitalism is grounded by the cultural work that its commodities are allegedly doing in successful eradicating indigenous cultures and imposing an American way of life on local inhabitants. Give a very short version of this argument. It's a photograph of a sculpture representing Chinese individuals visiting a Coca-Cola stores and departing as miniature Coca-Cola people. This globalization viewpoint has at least three flaws. The first issue with globalization as cultural Americanization is that it relies on a very simplified understanding of culture, assuming that economic success equals cultural imposition. In other words, the acknowledgement of American corporations' obvious success in placing items in the majority of the world's marketplaces is interpreted as self-evident and unproblematically cultural success. For example, American sociologist Herbert Skeller says that American corporations' ability to profitably unload commodities around the world is resulting in a global capitalist culture in the United States. He says that media firms' purpose is to develop programs that supplies in their imagery and messagery the attitudes and viewpoints that create and reinforce their audience's attachment to the way things are in the overall system. With this position, there are two intertwined issues. To begin with, it is simply assumed that commodities are the same as culture. Establish the former and you can forecast the latter's features. If we believe that the mere global ability of these things is in itself a sign of a convergence towards a capitalist monoculture, we are probably using a fairly improvised understanding of culture, one that reduces culture to its material objects, write John Tomlinson, 1999. It's possible that specific commodities are used, made relevant, and valued in ways that promote American capitalism as a way of life, but this can't be proven by assuming that market penetration is the same. Convergence culture. Convergence culture, in which old and new media meet, grassroots and corporate media mix, and the power of the media producer and the power of the media consumer interact in anticipated ways, is another facet of the postmodern. Convergence refers to the movement of media information across several platforms. This isn't just a matter of new technologies. It's a process that involves consumers' active engagement. Convergent cultures, like the majority of popular culture explored in this book, is a place of struggle and negotiation. It can't be explained or comprehended as something forced from above or something that emerged spontaneously from below, but rather as a complicated and paradoxical blend of both forces, Jenkins point out that there are three things contribute to convergence culture. The first is media ownership concentration. Producers that own a variety of platforms are more likely to share their material across them. For example, a corporation might create a book based on the film, as well as a game based on both and market them in magazines and newspapers, as well as on the internet and through mobile phones provider. The second factor is technical advancement. As a result, a new set of platforms of media material has emerged. We can now do so much more with our mobile phones than merely make phone calls. For example, we may use it to shoot, transmit, and receive images and videos, create, send and receive music files, send and receive text messages, download information from the internet, receive goals alerts, play games, and use it as a calendar, alarm clock, and calculator. The third aspect is media consumers. For instance, I may listen to my favorite music on my laptop, CD or DVD player, iPad, car radio, or television or radio. The same music is made available on several platforms, but I must actively participate in order for the system to function. In addition, I choose the platform that best suit my enjoyment and convenience. As Neil Perryman points out, the British science fiction television program Doctor Who embraces convergence culture in a way that is unparalleled. The BBC has made the show available on mobile phones, podcasts, video blogs, websites, interactive red button adventures, and online games, among other media. It has also produced two companion series that put the protagonists in different situations. According to Perryman, since its return to our television screens in 2005, the Doctor Who series has actively embraced both the technical and cultural advances connected with media convergence. By using a series of evolving and shifting storytelling tactics across a wide range of media platforms, its producers have endeavors to deliver extra value content and narrative intricacy for both a committed fan base on a mainstream audience. So, that's the end of our report. Thank you for watching!